Full of hatred and arrogance, two racist officers thought they could break Jonathan and steal his money. But when their actions are revealed, fate teaches them an unexpected lesson. Karma comes to everyone, and now it's their turn to pay for their crimes. Want to know how justice caught up with the guilty? Subscribe so you don't miss out. How do you think this story will end? Write in the comments. Jonathan Davis, a decorated Marine with years of service behind him, stared at the clock on the dashboard, the ticking seconds echoing in his mind like a ticking bomb. His heart raced, knowing that every minute lost brought his brother Marcus one step closer to a prison sentence he didn't deserve. Jonathan had always been the protector, the strong one. From their days growing up in a poor neighborhood where danger lurked at every corner, Jonathan had vowed to always be there for Marcus. But now the stakes were higher than ever. Marcus's life was hanging by a thread. Marcus had been wrongfully arrested for drug dealing, a crime he hadn't committed. The only reason the police had singled him out was because of his skin color. There were no real witnesses, no hard evidence. Just a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jonathan had seen this kind of injustice too many times in his life, and now it had hit home in the worst possible way. Jonathan had spent the last week selling off everything he owned to save his brother. He had liquidated his successful businesses, ones he had built with sweat and determination after leaving the military. His prized cars, his investments, his future security, everything was gone. All that mattered was saving Marcus. He knew that the bail amount was absurdly high, but he didn't care. His brother's life was worth more than any material possession. The thought of Marcus sitting in that cold, dehumanizing cell made Jonathan's blood boil. Marcus was a gentle soul, a man who had spent his life avoiding trouble. But the system, the deeply flawed and prejudiced system, had targeted him. Jonathan had seen the same thing while serving overseas. Good men, loyal men, being torn down because of circumstances beyond their control. He wasn't about to let that happen to his brother. Jonathan's hands tightened around the steering wheel of his luxury car, his last remaining possession. It was ironic, he thought, that the same car that had once symbolized his success and escape from poverty now felt like a cage. He had worked so hard to achieve the American dream, only to see it ripped apart by the very system he had fought to protect. But today wasn't about lamenting the past. Today was about one thing: getting to the courthouse on time with the bail money. If he didn't make it, Marcus could face years behind bars, all because of a baseless accusation. The sun was setting, casting an orange hue over the highway as Jonathan sped down the nearly empty road. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm, memories of his military service, his business successes, and the countless times he had shielded Marcus from the world's ugliness. His brother had always looked up to him, relied on him, and now, more than ever, Jonathan needed to come through. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Not now. He didn't have time for this. The courthouse was just an hour away, and every minute spent here was a minute closer to losing everything. He briefly considered ignoring the sirens, but he knew better. A black man in a luxury car speeding down the highway. He didn't need to give the cops any more reason to come after him. He pulled over to the side of the road, taking deep breaths to calm the storm brewing inside him. He was a Marine, disciplined and trained to stay calm in high-stress situations. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield in a foreign country. This was his life, his brother's life on the line. The police car pulled up behind him and two officers stepped out. Even from the rear-view mirror, Jonathan could feel their eyes on him. Cold, judgmental, filled with prejudice. He'd seen that look 1,000 times before. One of the officers, a bulky man with a buzz cut and a smug grin plastered on his face, walked up to Jonathan's window. The other officer, leaner but with the same air of authority and disdain, hovered nearby, hand resting dangerously close to his holster. Jonathan rolled down the window, keeping his hands on the steering wheel, fully aware of how easily things could go wrong in situations like this. "License and registration," the bulky officer barked, his voice filled with hostility. Jonathan nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet. "I'm in a hurry," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have to get to the courthouse. My brother—" The officer cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Oh, I'm sure you're in a hurry. What's the matter? Running late for your next drug drop?" Jonathan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew what this was. The officer didn't care about his explanation, didn't care about his brother or the courthouse. All he saw was a black man in a fancy car, and that was enough for him to assume the worst. "I'm not a drug dealer," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice level. "I'm a Marine, and I'm on my way to bail out my brother who's been wrongfully arrested." The officer's eyes flickered with a moment of recognition at the mention of Jonathan's service, but it was quickly replaced by a sneer. "Oh, a Marine? Well, aren't you just a hero?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "And I'm sure this car," he gestured to the luxury vehicle, "was bought with all that hard-earned military money, right?" The second officer stepped closer, his hand still resting on his holster, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Jonathan felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he suppressed it. He couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Reluctantly, he stepped out of the car, keeping his hands visible. The officers immediately began to search the vehicle without any further explanation. Jonathan stood by, watching helplessly as they rifled through his things, their eyes gleaming when they found the suitcase in the back seat. The bulky officer opened it, revealing the stacks of cash Jonathan had painstakingly gathered to save his brother. "Well, well, well," the officer drawled, lifting one of the stacks. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real entrepreneur here. Care to explain where all this came from?" "It's bail money," Jonathan replied through gritted teeth. "For my brother. He's been wrongfully accused, and I'm trying to help him." The officers exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Jonathan could see the greed in their eyes. They didn't care about the truth. They had already made up their minds about him. "You expect us to believe that?" the second officer said with a sneer. "That's a lot of cash for someone like you. Seems more likely you're running something illegal." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "I have proof. I sold my businesses to get this money. I can show you the paperwork." But the bulky officer was already closing the suitcase, a satisfied smirk on his face. "We'll be taking this in as evidence," he said, ignoring Jonathan's protests. "And you're coming with us." Before Jonathan could react, the second officer had him in handcuffs, his grip rough and unforgiving. Jonathan's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He was running out of time. Marcus was depending on him, and now these officers were about to ruin everything. As they shoved him into the back of the police car, Jonathan could feel the weight of the situation crushing him. The courthouse was slipping further and further away, and with it, his brother's only chance at freedom. He couldn't let this happen. But as the doors slammed shut and the car pulled away, Jonathan realized he might have no choice. Jonathan sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, the cold metal biting into his wrists. His heart pounded with a mixture of fury and helplessness. The car moved steadily, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the tense silence. Jonathan's mind raced, replaying the events that had just transpired. How could this happen? He had a mission, a singular purpose, to save his brother from a fate he didn't deserve. But now, here he was, being dragged away by two officers who had already decided he was guilty, all because of the color of his skin and the money in his possession. The police car came to a stop in front of a secluded, dimly lit parking lot, far from any witnesses or traffic. The silence outside was oppressive, only adding to the dread building inside Jonathan. The two officers got out of the car, exchanging brief words that Jonathan couldn't hear, their postures rigid, their movements deliberate. They were planning something, and Jonathan knew it wouldn't end well for him. The larger officer, the one who had spoken the most, yanked open the door and pulled Jonathan roughly out of the car. His grip was harsh, almost punishing, as he shoved Jonathan against the side of the vehicle. "Think you're some big shot, huh?" the officer spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Driving around in that fancy car with a suitcase full of cash. Who do you think you are?" Jonathan stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. He knew better than to react, to give them any more ammunition. His training taught him to maintain control, even when the situation was dire. But the rage inside him simmered, threatening to spill over. These men didn't care about his story. To them, he was already guilty. The second officer, lean and sharp-eyed, circled around the car, his hand resting casually on his holster. He didn't speak, but his silence was more menacing than any words he could have said. He was waiting, watching, as if daring Jonathan to make the wrong move. "I'm telling you," Jonathan said through gritted teeth. "The money is for my brother's bail. He's been wrongfully arrested, and I'm trying to help him. I'm not involved in anything illegal." The bulky officer let out a bark of laughter. "Oh, I'm sure. Let me guess, you're an upstanding citizen, right? A Marine, or some other noble thing?" He leaned in closer, his breath hot against Jonathan's face. "Let me tell you something, boy. People like you don't just walk around with that kind of money unless they've been doing something dirty, so don't try to play innocent with me." Jonathan's hands curled into fists behind his back, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel the pulse of anger thumping in his veins, but he forced himself to stay calm. They wanted him to react, to lash out so they could justify their actions. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "You can check my record," Jonathan said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm a Marine. I've served this country for years. I earned every penny I have. I sold my businesses to help my brother, and I have the paperwork to prove it." The second officer finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "Doesn't matter what you say. You look guilty to me, and you know how this works, right? If you look guilty, you are guilty." Jonathan's stomach churned at the blatant injustice in their words. He had heard stories like this before, about how the system was rigged against people like him, how black men were always assumed to be criminals first and humans second. But knowing it and living it were two entirely different things. The bulky officer opened the suitcase again, his fingers running greedily over the stacks of cash. "This is enough to make you disappear for a long time, boy," he sneered. "We could say you resisted arrest. We could say anything we want. And you know what? No one would question it." Jonathan's blood turned cold. This was more than just an arrest. These men were threatening his life. The reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. He was alone, outnumbered, and at their mercy. And these weren't men of justice. They were predators. "I'm not going to resist," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know my rights. You can't just take my money and accuse me without evidence." The lean officer stepped closer, his hand still resting on his gun. His eyes were sharp, full of unspoken threats. "Your rights? Let me explain something to you. Your rights don't mean jack out here. Out here, we make the rules. And right now, the only rule you need to know is that we're in charge." Jonathan stared at the ground, his breath steady but his heart pounding. He was trained for combat, for high-stakes situations where life and death hung in the balance. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the rules were clear. This was the ugly side of America, the side that didn't care about honor or duty, the side that saw him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The bulky officer stepped back, pulling a radio from his belt. "We're going to take you downtown," he said, his voice all business now. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself there. In the meantime, we'll be holding on to this." He snapped the suitcase shut with a loud click, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot like a death sentence. Jonathan's stomach dropped. They were going to take the money. His brother's last chance at freedom was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do about it. His mind raced, trying to think of some way out, some way to reason with these men. But every option led to the same conclusion. They had already decided his fate. The second officer moved behind Jonathan and tightened the cuffs, his grip deliberate, almost cruel. "Let's go," he muttered, pushing Jonathan toward the back of the police car. Jonathan stumbled forward but kept his balance, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He had fought in wars, faced enemies who wanted to kill him, but somehow this felt worse. This felt personal. As they shoved him into the back seat, Jonathan felt the crushing weight of the situation settle over him. The car door slammed shut with a heavy thud, sealing him inside. The two officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. They knew what they were doing. They knew that taking him in would ruin his chances of saving Marcus. The drive to the police station was suffocating. The inside of the car felt smaller with every passing second, the air thick with the unspoken tension between Jonathan and the officers. He tried to focus on his breathing, to keep his mind from spiraling into despair. But it was hard. Every mile they drove took him further away from the courthouse, further away from the chance to help his brother. The bulky officer glanced at Jonathan in the rearview mirror, his expression a twisted mix of arrogance and amusement. "You know, you could have just stayed out of trouble, but you people always find a way to get yourselves caught." Jonathan bit back the urge to respond. He knew nothing he said would change their minds. They had already decided he was guilty, and nothing would convince them otherwise. He just had to survive this. He had to get through the night, and then maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make things right. But as they pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the police station, Jonathan felt a sinking realization. This wasn't just about him anymore. These officers were going to take everything: his money, his time, and his dignity, and there was no guarantee he would make it out unscathed. The car came to a stop, and the officers stepped out, pulling Jonathan from the back seat once again. The lean officer shoved him roughly, guiding him toward the entrance of the station. The bulky officer followed, the suitcase clutched tightly in his hand. As they walked through the doors, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. His fight for justice had just begun, but he was already losing ground. Jonathan's legs felt heavy as they dragged him through the doors of the police station. The air inside was thick, stifling, and carried the faint scent of sweat and disinfectant. His heart pounded in his chest, a relentless beat that refused to slow down, no matter how much he tried to control his breathing. His wrists were sore, the metal cuffs biting into his skin with every forced step, and a sickening sense of helplessness began to settle in his gut. The two officers, who had already made their judgment, continued to escort him through the dimly lit corridors, past desks cluttered with paperwork and officers who barely gave him a second glance. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they could get away with anything. The larger officer, still clutching the suitcase, led the way while the lean officer prodded Jonathan from behind. Every step felt like he was being pushed deeper into a pit, further away from any semblance of justice. Jonathan knew they didn't care about the truth. To them, he was just another black man who dared to drive a nice car and carry a large amount of cash. And for that, he was guilty in their eyes. As they entered a small, windowless room, the bulky officer tossed the suitcase onto a metal table with a loud thud before turning to Jonathan with a twisted grin. "Well, look what we've got here," he said, his tone mocking. "A Marine turned drug dealer. Who would have thought?" Jonathan stood in the middle of the room, his hands still cuffed behind his back, trying to steady his breathing. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, survived ambushes, and seen men fall in battle. But here, in this room, he felt more vulnerable than ever before. Not because these men had power, but because they were using that power to strip him of everything. His dignity, his freedom, and, most importantly, his chance to help his brother. "I'm not a drug dealer," Jonathan said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've explained this already. The money is for my brother's bail. He's been wrongfully accused. I have all the paperwork." The lean officer cut him off with a snort, his cold eyes narrowing as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You can save your breath. No one here cares about your excuses." Jonathan clenched his jaw, swallowing the bitter words that threatened to spill out. He knew better than to argue. These men had no interest in listening. They had already painted a target on his back, and nothing he said would change their minds. The larger officer opened the suitcase once more, fanning through the stacks of cash with an exaggerated gesture. "This is what bothers me, though," he said, raising an eyebrow in mock curiosity. "Why would a decorated Marine need to carry this much cash? Unless, of course, you've found a side hustle that pays better than serving your country." Jonathan stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the table. He knew there was nothing he could say to convince them otherwise. They had already spun their narrative, and it didn't matter how far it was from the truth. The larger officer stepped closer, his presence looming. "You see, it's people like you who think you can get away with anything," he said, his voice growing colder. "You think because you served, or because you've got some fancy car and some cash, that you're untouchable. But not here. Not in my station." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of their hatred, the prejudice in their eyes. They wanted him to break, to lash out so they could justify their cruelty. But Jonathan had been trained to endure worse. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. "I know my rights," Jonathan said calmly, though the anger simmered beneath the surface. "I'm entitled to a phone call. I want to speak to my lawyer." The room fell silent for a moment, the air thick with tension. The lean officer's lip curled into a sneer. "Your rights?" he said, stepping forward. You really think you have rights in here?" The bulky officer laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You'll get your phone call when we say so. Right now, we have more important things to deal with, like figuring out where you got all this cash." Jonathan's chest tightened with frustration, but he forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't going to lose control, no matter how much they provoked him. He had been in worse situations, faced men who wanted to kill him. But this was a different kind of battlefield, one where his life and his freedom were at the mercy of corrupt men who had no regard for justice. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room opened, and a third officer walked in carrying a clipboard. He glanced at Jonathan before turning to the other two officers. "You boys done here?" he asked, his tone neutral, as though this was just another routine day at the station. "Almost," the bulky officer replied, still eyeing Jonathan with contempt. "Just sorting out this guy's little operation." The third officer gave a small shrug, seemingly uninterested in the details. "Well, we've got a holding cell ready for him, unless you want to keep playing games." The lean officer smirked. "Nah, we're done here. Let's get him locked up." Jonathan's stomach twisted as they grabbed him by the arms and led him out of the room. His mind raced. Every second they spent dragging him through this humiliating process was another second closer to losing everything. The courthouse was slipping further and further away, and with it, his brother's only chance at freedom. As they led him down the narrow corridor, Jonathan couldn't help but think about all the other men who had been in his position. How many lives had been ruined by men like these? How many innocent people had been broken under the weight of a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the vulnerable? When they reached the holding cell, the bulky officer unlocked the door and shoved Jonathan inside. The metal bars clanged shut behind him with a deafening finality. Jonathan stood there, staring at the cold, gray walls, his hands still cuffed, his mind reeling. "This is where you belong," the bulky officer said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You're just another criminal who thought he could outsmart the system, but you'll learn. They all do." With that, the officers left, the sound of their boots echoing down the hall. Jonathan was alone now, locked in a cage like an animal. His wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight crushing him. He had done everything right. He had served his country, built a successful life, and was trying to do the right thing for his brother. But none of that mattered to these men. To them, he was guilty the moment they saw the color of his skin. Jonathan sat on the hard metal bench, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out, had to find a way to make things right. Marcus was counting on him. His brother had already been through so much: the wrongful arrest, the fear, the isolation. Jonathan had promised he would save him, and now he was trapped, powerless to keep that promise. But he wasn't going to give up. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let these men destroy everything he had worked for. His lawyer would be contacted soon. His family would fight for him. He just had to hold on to survive this nightmare. As the minutes stretched into hours, Jonathan forced himself to stay calm. He had been through worse. He had faced death on the battlefield, seen men lose their lives in an instant. This was just another fight, another battle for survival. And like every battle before, he would come out the other side. But the anger wouldn't go away. It simmered beneath the surface, a slow-burning fire that refused to be extinguished. He thought of his brother, of the injustice they had both faced. He thought of the officers, their smug faces and cruel words. He thought of the system that had allowed men like them to thrive, while men like him were punished simply for existing. He wouldn't let them win. He couldn't. The hours stretched on in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, each minute dragging Jonathan further into a crushing sense of despair. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the silence, broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps down the corridor, was oppressive. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions, battling between helplessness and the determination to fight back. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Jonathan's hands still throbbed from the cuffs that had dug into his wrists. His entire body ached from the strain of tension and restraint, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the officers, sneering, smug, filled with a hateful certainty that they had complete control over him. They had taken his freedom, his dignity, and most painfully, the only chance he had to save his brother. Marcus. The thought of his brother, sitting in a cell just like this one, facing a system rigged against him, sent a fresh wave of anger surging through Jonathan. Marcus didn't deserve this. He had been a good man, an honest man, someone who had always stayed away from trouble. But trouble had found him anyway, simply because of the color of his skin. Jonathan couldn't allow that to happen. Not to Marcus. Not when he had fought so hard to protect him all these years. He had given up everything, his business, his cars, his future, to save his brother, and now it all seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Suddenly, the clanging of metal broke the silence, jolting Jonathan back to the present. He looked up to see a guard unlocking the door to his cell. His heart leapt with a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished when the door swung open and the lean officer from earlier stepped inside, followed by another officer with a clipboard. The lean officer gave Jonathan a cold, appraising look. "Still here, huh? Thought you'd be out by now, what with all your connections?" His voice was laced with mockery, and Jonathan felt his hands tighten into fists by his sides. "I wanted to speak to my lawyer," Jonathan said, forcing his voice to remain calm. He had to stay in control no matter how much they pushed him. "I have a right to legal representation, and I demand that phone call." The officer with the clipboard barely glanced at Jonathan before turning to the lean officer. "We've got the paperwork from the evidence room. Looks like everything checks out on our end. No need to keep him here much longer." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could this nightmare be coming to an end? He stared at the officer with the clipboard, trying to make sense of the words, but the lean officer wasn't so quick to let go. He stepped closer to Jonathan, his eyes narrowing. "Just because we've got some paperwork doesn't mean you're off the hook," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're still under investigation, and we'll be watching you. Don't think for a second that we're done here." Jonathan held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I haven't done anything wrong. You have no right to hold me here without cause. You know that." The lean officer's lip curled into a sneer, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for the guard to follow him out of the cell. As they left, the door slammed shut with a resounding echo, leaving Jonathan alone again. But this time, something had shifted. The oppressive weight that had hung over him since his arrest had lightened, just a fraction, but enough for him to breathe again. The clipboard officer's words replayed in his mind. No need to keep him here much longer. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this after all. As the hours dragged on, Jonathan sat in the cell, his thoughts racing. He knew his lawyer had to be working behind the scenes to get him out, and his family, who had always been his strongest support system, wouldn't sit idly by. He pictured them now, contacting everyone they knew, pulling every string they could to ensure he didn't spend another night behind bars. His lawyer was smart, resourceful, and relentless. Everything Jonathan needed in this moment. But even with the flicker of hope, Jonathan knew he couldn't just sit here and wait. He had to think, to plan his next move. He wasn't a passive man. He had been trained to take action, to control the situation. And that's what he would do now. He remembered the papers he had filed to sell his businesses, the legal contracts and documents that clearly showed the sale of his properties, all to raise the money for Marcus's bail. If they could get those documents in front of a judge, if they could prove that the money was legitimate, then there would be no reason for the police to hold him any longer. Jonathan's mind began to formulate a plan. He would make sure his lawyer had every document, every piece of proof necessary to expose the lies the officers were spinning. The thought of exposing them for what they really were, racists hiding behind badges, gave him strength. These men thought they could bury him, destroy him, and take everything he had, but they had underestimated him. Jonathan wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his brother, and he wasn't going to lose. As Jonathan's mind raced with possibilities, the clanging of the door interrupted his thoughts once again. This time it wasn't the lean officer or the guards. It was his lawyer, a tall, sharp-eyed woman named Kelly, with a determined look on her face. She walked into the cell with purpose, her presence filling the small room with a sense of urgency and control. "Jonathan," she said, her voice brisk but reassuring, "we're working on getting you out of here, but I need you to be patient. I've spoken to the district attorney, and we're pushing back hard on the lack of evidence for your arrest." Jonathan nodded, relief flooding through him at the sight of her. Kelly had been his lawyer for years, ever since he had started his business, and she had never let him down. If anyone could get him out of this, it was her. "They've got nothing," Kelly continued, her voice growing more confident. "The money they took from you is legally yours, and we've already submitted the paperwork proving it. The officers who arrested you are walking on thin ice, and we're going to make sure they slip." Jonathan's chest tightened with gratitude, but also with a renewed sense of determination. "What about Marcus?" he asked, his voice tense. "Is he okay? Have they—" Kelly held up a hand. "Marcus is fine. We've spoken to his public defender, and they're working on getting him out too. But right now, we need to focus on you. If we can get you cleared, then we'll have a stronger case to help Marcus, one step at a time." Jonathan exhaled slowly, trying to release some of the tension that had built up in his body. He trusted Kelly, and he knew she was right. He couldn't help Marcus if he was stuck in this cell, but knowing that Marcus was okay, at least for now, gave him the clarity he needed to focus on the task at hand. Kelly stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Jonathan, listen to me. These officers, they're corrupt. I've been looking into their records, and this isn't the first time they've pulled something like this. There are complaints against them, racial profiling, excessive force, the whole lot. But no one has been able to make it stick. Yet." Jonathan's heart quickened. "What are you saying?" Kelly's eyes narrowed with determination. "I'm saying we're not just going to clear your name. We're going to take them down. For every person they've wrongfully arrested, for every life they've ruined. This is bigger than just you, Jonathan. This is about exposing the system they've been abusing for years." Jonathan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This was his chance. Not just to save himself and his brother, but to strike back at the system that had victimized them both. The same system that had tried to destroy countless others like him. For the first time since his arrest, Jonathan felt the fire inside him burn with renewed intensity. He had been trained to fight, to survive, and now, with Kelly by his side, he was ready to wage war. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady and resolved. "Let's take them down." Kelly nodded, a fierce smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Good. Now sit tight. I'm going to get you out of here." As Kelly left the cell, Jonathan sat back on the bench, his mind clearer than it had been in hours. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He wasn't just going to walk out of this as a free man. He was going to walk out of this as a victor. The system had tried to break him, but it had only made him stronger, and now he was ready to fight back. The next day dawned in a blur for Jonathan. The cold, sterile walls of the holding cell did little to reflect the fire that had ignited inside him. The conversation with Kelly from the night before had shifted his perspective. He was no longer just a man trying to free himself and his brother from an unjust system. Now he was a man ready to expose the corruption that had kept them, and countless others, imprisoned for far too long. The morning was quiet. No officers had come to harass him. No one had brought him out for further questioning. The lean and bulky officers hadn't shown their faces since the previous night. It was as if the tide had begun to shift. The eerie silence was only occasionally broken by distant sounds of ringing phones and murmurs from the other side of the station. Jonathan sat on the hard metal bench, staring at the narrow slit of a window that barely let any light into the cell. His mind raced with thoughts about Kelly's revelations. The officers who had arrested him, two men so steeped in their own arrogance and hatred, were finally close to being exposed. Their actions, part of a larger systemic abuse of power, were about to be dragged into the light. The door to the holding cell creaked open, and Jonathan turned to see Kelly stride in with the same determined expression she had worn the night before. Behind her was a man in a suit, a district attorney, judging by the formal air and the thick folder he carried in his hand. Kelly's eyes met Jonathan's, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he saw a glimmer of victory. "Jonathan," Kelly began, her voice calm but firm, "I've got good news, but I need you to be patient just a little while longer. We're almost there." Jonathan stood, his muscles stiff from the long night in the cell, but his mind sharper than ever. "What's the news?" The district attorney stepped forward, opening the folder he carried. "We've reviewed the evidence, Mr. Davis, and frankly, the charges against you are baseless. The arresting officers didn't have probable cause to stop you in the first place. Your money is accounted for, and your records are clean. We're dropping all charges." Jonathan felt a weight lift off his chest. The words were like a breath of fresh air after being submerged underwater for too long. He had known all along that he was innocent, but hearing it confirmed by the district attorney was something else entirely. "But," the district attorney continued, his tone serious, "we're not just here to let you go. We've also uncovered some troubling details about the officers involved in your arrest. Complaints have been filed against them in the past, though nothing ever stuck. Until now." Kelly stepped in. "These two officers have been operating like this for years, Jonathan. Racial profiling, harassment, excessive force, you name it. They've gotten away with it because no one was able to challenge them effectively. But this time, with your case, we've got enough to expose them and push for an investigation." Jonathan's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The lean and bulky officers, with their smug attitudes and hateful glares, had probably done this countless times before. They had wielded their power like a weapon, believing no one would challenge them, and for the most part, they had been right. Until now. "What do you need from me?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady but filled with purpose. Kelly smiled, the kind of smile that promised justice. "I need you to testify. Your testimony, combined with the evidence we've gathered, will be enough to not only clear your name, but to bring those officers down. This could lead to a full investigation of the department, which means exposing even more corruption if there is any." Jonathan nodded. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes to stop them." The district attorney closed the folder, his expression serious. "You should know, Mr. Davis, that this won't be easy. These officers have friends in high places. They'll fight back hard, and it's going to get messy. But if you're willing to go through with this, we'll be with you every step of the way." Jonathan took a deep breath. The idea of going up against a corrupt system was daunting, but he had faced worse in his life. He had fought in wars, faced enemies who were determined to kill him. These officers, with all their hatred and prejudice, were no different. They were just hiding behind a badge. "I'm not afraid," Jonathan said firmly. "I've spent my life fighting for the truth. I'm not going to stop now." Kelly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Good. We'll begin the process of getting you out of here immediately. Once you're free, we'll start preparing for your testimony. In the meantime, you'll need to keep your guard up. These men won't go down without a fight, and we can't predict what they'll do once they realize we're coming for them." Jonathan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about justice, for him, for Marcus, and for every other person these officers had wronged. The rest of the day passed in a blur of legal paperwork and meetings. Jonathan's release was expedited thanks to Kelly's relentless efforts and the district attorney's cooperation. When the sun began to set, Jonathan finally walked out of the police station, the weight of the cuffs lifted from his wrists but the battle far from over. Outside, Kelly was waiting for him. The cool evening air was a welcome relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the station. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders start to loosen, if only slightly. "You did it," Kelly said, her eyes filled with admiration. "You're free." Jonathan nodded, though he knew this was only the beginning. "What about Marcus? We need to get him out too." Kelly's expression softened. "We're working on it. Now that your charges have been dropped, we're using that to push for Marcus's release. His case is more complicated, but I promise you, Jonathan, we won't stop until he's free." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving him in there." Kelly shook her head. "I know, and you won't have to for long. We're making progress, and soon Marcus will be walking out of those doors just like you." Jonathan's mind drifted back to the officers, their sneers, their threats. What about them? What's our next move? Kelly's eyes hardened. "Next, we prepare. We'll be filing formal complaints with Internal Affairs, and your testimony will be crucial in making sure those men never have the chance to do this to anyone else. But we need to be smart. They'll be watching you, and they'll be looking for any reason to retaliate." Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not afraid of them. They think they can keep doing this because no one ever stands up to them, but I will. For Marcus. For every other person they've hurt." Kelly smiled, a small, encouraging smile that reminded him that they were in this together. "And we'll make sure they're held accountable." Jonathan looked up at the darkening sky, his mind clearer now than it had been in days. He wasn't just fighting for his brother's freedom anymore. He was fighting for justice. Justice that had been denied to too many people for far too long. "We'll take them down," Jonathan said, his voice steady, his resolve unshakable, no matter what. As they left the police station, the weight of the upcoming battle hung in the air. But this time, Jonathan wasn't facing it alone. With Kelly by his side and the evidence piling up against the corrupt officers, he was ready to fight for what was right. The war had just begun, and Jonathan Davis was prepared for every battle that lay ahead. The next few weeks felt like a battlefield all over again for Jonathan. The fights weren't physical, but they were just as grueling, just as mentally and emotionally taxing. This time, though, the enemy wasn't wearing a uniform from some foreign country. They wore badges from the same system Jonathan had fought to protect, and they wielded power like a weapon, ready to destroy anyone who dared challenge them. But Jonathan wasn't backing down. He had already fought too hard, sacrificed too much, and this time he had justice on his side. Kelly had been right. The officers who arrested him weren't going to go down without a fight. The moment they realized Jonathan wasn't just another victim they could bully into submission, they dug their heels in deeper. The officers, backed by their powerful allies within the department, tried everything to discredit him, to paint him as the criminal they had wanted him to be from the start. They leaked details of his arrest to the press, spinning the story to make Jonathan look like a man with something to hide. They dragged up every minor infraction in his past, trying to tarnish his reputation. But Jonathan stood firm. He knew the truth. More importantly, he knew Kelly had armed him with the evidence that would tear their lies apart. The truth was like a shield, and he wielded it with the same precision he'd once used on the battlefield. His businesses, his records, everything was in order, everything was legitimate. They had nothing on him. The only crime he had committed in their eyes was being a black man with money, and now that crime was being used as the catalyst to take them down. As Jonathan prepared for his day in court, the anticipation was palpable. The testimony he would give wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about bringing to light the corruption that had festered in the police department for far too long. Kelly had spent weeks gathering evidence, interviewing other victims of the same officers, piecing together a case so solid that even their most powerful allies couldn't ignore it. The day of the hearing, Jonathan stood outside the courthouse, taking a deep breath as he looked up at the imposing building. His heart raced, but not with fear, with determination. This was the moment he had been fighting for. This was the day when everything would come to light. "Ready?" Kelly's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She stood beside him, a folder thick with evidence in her hands, her expression calm but fierce. She had been his rock through this entire ordeal, and Jonathan knew he couldn't have made it this far without her. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jonathan replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. They walked into the courthouse together, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The room was packed. Reporters, officials, and members of the community who had heard about the case. Jonathan could feel their eyes on him, could feel the tension in the air as they waited for the proceedings to begin. On the other side of the room, he saw them, the two officers who had arrested him, the men who had tried to destroy him. The lean officer sat with his arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face, as if he still believed he would come out of this unscathed. The bulky officer glanced around nervously, his eyes shifting from the crowd to the judge, then back to his partner. Jonathan could tell that reality was starting to set in for them. They were no longer in control. They had lost the upper hand. As the hearing began, Kelly laid out their case with surgical precision. She presented the evidence, The video footage from the police station showing the officers mishandling the money, the documentation proving that Jonathan's businesses were legitimate, and the testimonies from other victims who had been wrongfully arrested and harassed by the same officers. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in the coffin, and Jonathan could see the confidence drain from the officers' faces as the truth unraveled before them. When it was Jonathan's turn to testify, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he took the stand, his hands steady on the podium. He recounted everything: the traffic stop, the racist remarks, the way they had taken his money and thrown him into a cell without any cause. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of his experience, the weight of the injustice he had endured. The prosecutor tried to poke holes in his story, but it was futile. The evidence was too strong, and Jonathan's resolve was unshakable. He didn't flinch, didn't waver. He was speaking not just for himself, but for every person who had been victimized by these men, for Marcus, who was still fighting his own battle behind bars. When the cross-examination ended, Jonathan returned to his seat beside Kelly. She gave him a reassuring nod, her confidence unwavering. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the judge. The room held its breath as the judge delivered his ruling. He spoke of the overwhelming evidence of misconduct by the officers, of the clear violations of Jonathan's rights, and of the systemic racism that had allowed these officers to continue their behavior for so long without consequences. Then, finally, he declared the charges against Jonathan dropped and ordered an immediate investigation into the officers' conduct. The room erupted into whispers, the weight of the moment sinking in for everyone present. Jonathan sat back in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. It was over. He had won. Not just for himself, but for Marcus, for the community, for every person who had been wronged by these men. As the officers were led out of the courtroom, their smug expressions replaced with ones of fear and disbelief, Jonathan felt a sense of justice wash over him. They had been untouchable for so long, but now their reign of terror was over. The investigation would bring to light all the skeletons in their closet, and they would finally face the consequences of their actions. But the victory wasn't just about bringing down two corrupt officers. It was about something bigger, about exposing the system that had allowed them to thrive in the first place. Jonathan knew this wasn't the end of the fight. The battle for justice, for equality, was far from over, but today they had won an important victory. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Jonathan and Kelly, microphones thrust into their faces as questions flew at them from every direction. Jonathan, still processing everything that had just happened, turned to Kelly. "Are you ready for this?" she asked with a smile, knowing the media frenzy was just the beginning of their next challenge. Jonathan took a deep breath and nodded. "I've never been more ready." As he faced the cameras, Jonathan spoke with a clarity and strength he hadn't known he possessed. He spoke about the injustice he had faced, about the corruption in the system, and about the need for change. His words weren't just for the cameras, they were for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice, for every person who had ever been silenced by a system that wasn't built for them. When the interviews were over, Jonathan stepped away from the crowd and looked up at the sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. He could finally see the light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. Kelly joined him, her hand resting on his arm. "You did it, Jonathan. You really did it." Jonathan smiled, though there was a bittersweet edge to it. "We did it, but there's still more to do. Marcus is still in there. We're not done until he's free." Kelly nodded, her expression serious but determined. "We'll get him out. I promise you that." Jonathan knew she was right. They had fought hard to get this far, and they wouldn't stop now. Marcus's freedom was just within reach, and they would fight until he was standing here with them, free from the chains of injustice. As they walked away from the courthouse, Jonathan felt lighter. The battle wasn't over, but they had won this round. And as long as there were people like Kelly fighting by his side, Jonathan knew they would win the war too. Justice had been served today, but tomorrow they would continue the fight for a better, fairer world. And Jonathan was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss new videos. Also, be sure to check out our other stories where we explore important topics and raise relevant issues. Your opinion is important to us. Leave a comment and tell us what you think about this story. See you in the next videos.